Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service through a special partnership with Alaska Public Media. It is Sunday, November 20th, 2022. And if you'd like additional weather information on top of what I provide in this broadcast, you can go to weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's online presence. It'll bring you to a map of the continental U.S. with Alaska and Hawaii in the lower left. All you have to do is point and click a mouse anywhere on the map, and it'll bring up a forecast and any relevant watches, warnings, or advisories. And there's plenty of other information to find if you explore the site. Looking at the map this Sunday afternoon, we continue to have heavy lake effect snows going on downwind of Lakes Erie and Ontario. In fact, we had a report of record snowfall there just southeast of Buffalo at Orchard Park. 77 inches of snow from this event. It's the same place where the Buffalo Bills play football. They had to move the game to Detroit because of all the heavy snow. Further west, you'll see an area of dark gray over the Pacific Northwest, Washington, Oregon, Idaho. That's due to air stagnation, poor air quality, have a temperature inversion that's trapping smoke and pollutants and exhaust, and not a good situation. The high pressure responsible for that, though, is going to break down here early this coming week. Same part of the same high that brought us rather clear conditions here, middle and latter portions of this past week. But we've seen a change in the overall pattern. Right now, there is a wintry mix of precipitation moving up in through the Susitna Valley from the Anchorage Bowl, and it does include a little freezing rain. Nothing too terribly heavy, but there could be some very slippery roads and spots here this evening. If you were to venture out from Anchorage on up through Eagle River and up along areas like toward Willow or Talkeetna. Snow and wind is going to be picking up in areas along the west coast, including through the lower Chukchi Sea, Bering Strait, the north side of St. Lawrence Island, where there is a winter weather advisory in effect. Strong winds and heavy rain are moving into the Panhandle, especially later tonight and through the day Monday. And yet, a stronger system is forecast to impact the Panhandle with storm force low Wednesday into Thanksgiving Day. So we'll talk a little more about that. But in the meantime, looking at the FAA webcams, this Sunday afternoon, Point Hope up there, way in the northwest. Cloudy, breezy, look for winds to be picking up there. We anticipate that we could see some winds gusting at times of around 30, 40 miles an hour, along with periods of light to moderate snow. Now at Savunga, we also expect the winds to be picking up overnight into Monday with some periods of moderate snow developing. Temperature there, at least as of early Sunday afternoon, was at 30 degrees. Now in the Anchorage area, we've seen some light freezing rain develop this Sunday afternoon, and it will continue into at least the early evening. There is a winter weather advisory in effect for the Anchorage Bowl as well as the Susitna Valley through midnight this Sunday evening. And then in the southeast, Heidelberg, expect increasing wind and rain as that frontal band moves inland, especially during the day on Monday, where there is a high wind warning in effect for the southern portions of the Panhandle. And taking a look at these advisories and warnings, you can see the high wind warning there in the southern Panhandle. It includes Ketchikan, Metlakatla, as well as Craig. Heidelberg, we could see some winds gust as high as 50, 60 miles an hour, especially in the surrounding higher elevations there in those areas. And then further to the west this evening, we have the winter weather advisory for that mix of precipitation, including some light freezing rain for the Anchorage Bowl up through the Susitna Valley until midnight this Sunday night. There is a high wind advisory, I should say a wind advisory for the eastern half of the Alaska Range, including Isabel Pass. There could be some wind gusts 50 to near 60 miles an hour through some of the gaps and passes there. And then finally, way in the west side of the Seward Peninsula, including places like Wales, Tin City, and then into St. Lawrence Island, Gamble, Savunga, under winter weather advisories for a combination of wind and snow, and also there'll be some heavier freezing spray as a result of those strong northeast to north winds. And looking at the high wind warning in effect for the southern Panhandle on Monday, strongest winds are expected to accompany that frontal band In the latter half of the morning into the early afternoon, roughly between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., there could be some wind gusts, 45 to near 60 miles an hour with the highest wind gust in some of the elevated areas around Klawak, Heidelberg, Ketchikan, and Metlakatla. And looking at the satellite imagery, we can see a couple of curls in the clouds there in the western Gulf. There's another impulse of energy coming up from the North Pacific, taking aim at the Panhandle. Meanwhile, there's a low kind of south there of Sand Point, southeast of Dutch Harbor, on the North Pacific side of things. And then up along the eastern area of Russia, there's an Arctic high, and it's the pressure difference between the low over the North Pacific, south of the peninsula, and out over the western Gulf, and the Arctic high in eastern Russia that's creating the strong pressure gradient and the stronger northeast to north winds that are going to be running down along the northwest Arctic coast, the lower Chukchi Sea, through the Bering Strait across St. Lawrence, and then places like St. Matthew, St. Paul, and especially just on the west side of Nunavik Island. Again, looking at the satellite imagery, we can see one curl in the clouds. There's an area of low pressure in the western Gulf, but then additional moisture is coming up from the North Pacific, taking aim at the Panhandle for Monday. So here is the situation this Sunday afternoon. Low pressure over the western Gulf just east of Kodiak Island. The other low sitting there just east-southeast of Dutch Harbor, just on the southern south of the southern tip of the peninsula. And ahead of this front, we have a frontal band that's pushing up now across the Gulf, approaching the Panhandle, and a stalled front that's going to begin to advance the colder air slowly eastward. That's out there over the central Bering and up through just west of the Bering Strait. Later tonight into early Monday morning, we see that next impulse or low coming out of the North Pacific now into the Gulf, south central, southeastern Gulf. That's going to have a surge of some wind and some heavier rain with it. On the west coast, we have a trough there, and then the colder air out over the Bering is going to inch its way toward the west coast and try to push into the western interior as we go through Monday and on Tuesday. So that as we get into Monday afternoon, we see the one low that's sitting up there now over the northern Gulf. That'll begin to weaken. Another low sitting just southwest of Kodiak Island, and then another weak low in the lower Yukon Valley. These lows sitting where they are, and with a pretty strong high over eastern Russia, creates the strong wind field, the northeast to north winds along the Chukchi Sea coast, down through the Bering Strait, and in through the islands from St. Lawrence down through St. Matthew, Nunavik Island, so that on Tuesday, we're starting to see some of that moisture, some areas of light snow pushing inland, a little colder air, and the breezy conditions continuing in those areas I mentioned there along the northwest and west coast. And as I mentioned earlier in the cast, there's going to be yet another strong storm force low come out of the North Pacific and move into the southeastern Gulf and impact the Panhandle later Wednesday into Thanksgiving Day. So stay tuned to later forecasts, as there will be likely wind and precipitation impacts with that just in time for the holiday. Quick check of the forecast low temperatures: above freezing in the Panhandle, near and just a little below freezing Anchorage Bowl northward. And then Monday afternoon, we should get temperatures near 50 at the outer southwestern coast there of the Panhandle. A little above freezing in Anchorage, 35 all the way up to Talkeetna in the Susitna Valley. Tuesday morning lows will generally stay above freezing in the Panhandle, but could dip a bit below freezing there. Anchorage down toward Kenai and Soldotna. And then Tuesday afternoon, we expect temperatures upper 40s to near 50 at Sitka and Craig. Back toward Anchorage, maybe a little above freezing, certainly in the 40s, Homer down toward Kodiak. In the far north, we expect temperatures could dip a bit below zero in the Yukon flats and around Northway. Otherwise, teens common along the Arctic coast, lower 20s south of Point Hope, down along the Seward Peninsula. And for Monday afternoon, daytime highs, teens and 20s, pretty popular. Could stop in the single digits to 10 above there around Arctic Village, Fort Yukon. And then Tuesday morning lows could dip again in the single digits above or below zero in the normally cold Yukon flats, areas along the Alcan border and the eastern Brooks Range. And temperatures Tuesday will be a little cooler, generally in the teens across much of the north, along and north of the Yukon Valley. A few readings holding near 20 along the immediate lower Chukchi Sea coast around Kotzebue Sound and Norton Sound. Temperatures Monday morning, we're looking for lows along the southwestern coast, generally in the 20s, but at or above freezing from Dillingham, King Salmon southward down along the Alaska Peninsula. Monday afternoon highs could get up into the at least mid-40s, places like False Pass, Cold Bay, squeaking on up the peninsula. And as we go into Tuesday morning, lows should generally stay above freezing midway through the Alaska Peninsula. But notice it's turning colder out over the eastern Aleutians and the tip of the Alaska Peninsula. Some of that colder air under brisk north-northwest winds will allow for that to happen, along with some snow showers. And then Tuesday afternoon highs will definitely be cooler than what they have been there across the eastern Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula, as well as areas of the lower YK deltas. And a quick check of the temperature outlook to end the month of November, right after Thanksgiving holiday, November 26th. Through November 30th, we expect temperatures to average below normal across much of the mainland and southeast, so don't look for any real bumps in the temperatures coming up. Precipitation could average a little above normal north and west of the Alaska Range, along and north of the Yukon River, but a little below normal along the Gulf Coast and Panhandle, including areas around Cook Inlet.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Let's take a look at your aviation weather if you have a flight planned early this week, Monday or Tuesday. The main weather feature right now, we have an area of low pressure that is passing just south of the eastern Aleutians and south at the tip of the Alaska Peninsula through the North Pacific. That feature will gradually drift northeastward and kind of redevelop in through the northwestern Gulf as a weaker area of low pressure. Another impulse, low pressure lifting out of the North Pacific into the Gulf, will bring another round of precipitation with a frontal band in through the Panhandle, northeastern Gulf Coast as we go through later this Sunday night and on Monday. And yet a stronger system will likely impact areas of the northeastern Gulf and Panhandle later Wednesday into Thanksgiving Day. But before then, colder air is pouring in through the Bering Sea west of the west coast, and as that colder air inches eastward, it will bring gustier northeast and north winds along the west coast, along with areas of primarily light snow. You see the IFR conditions rather extensive there Monday morning along the west coast, eastern Bering, also extending up into areas of the western and northern Gulf. Monday afternoon, we see some of that moisture trying to push inland there through the west and northwest interior, so we expect IFR conditions to expand across the North Slope, Brooks Range, in through the western interior, and also persisting there along the northern Gulf Coast. For Tuesday morning, IFR conditions are rather extensive across areas of the north and west mainland, and then also continuing down there through areas of the northern and western Gulf, including Prince William Sound. For Tuesday afternoon, we still see rather widespread IFR conditions there in the northwest, down through the North Slope, Brooks Range, and also lingering there along the northern Gulf Coast into the northern areas of the Panhandle. And at Tuvik Pass should see conditions overall just become IFR. That'll be the trend for Monday. Same thing for Adigan Pass. Further south and west, we expect IFR conditions to hold along the west arm of the Alaska Range, Lake Clark and Merrill, up through Rainy Pass. There may be a little bit of a break there at Windy Pass, but the tendency will become at least MVFR, with the IFR conditions not that far off to the west. Isabel Pass could see a pocket of IFR conditions there in the morning, giving way to VFR. And then further east, generally VFR conditions are expected to persist at Mentasta Pass and along the Alcan border. Further south and west, Tanita Pass, MVFR. And Portage Pass should generally be seeing IFR conditions, especially the eastern half of Portage Pass out through Prince William Sound. And in the far northern Panhandle at Chilkoot and White Passes, we expect MVFR conditions to become IFR, especially later in the day and into Monday night. Freezing levels. The surface freezing line runs out through the lower Bering, just north of the western Aleutians, on up across the entrance there of the Alaska Peninsula, outer Kenai Peninsula, up along areas the interior northern Gulf Coast and Panhandle. Aloft freezing levels of 2,000 feet there down into the southwest, and then 4,000 feet along the outer reaches of the western coastline there of the Panhandle, 6,000 feet there over Haida Gwaii. Greatest threat for icing on Monday will be out over the northeastern Gulf, and especially in through areas of the Panhandle where there is some heavier precipitation with that frontal band above 4,000 and 6,000 feet, and then a broad area of above 2,000 and 3,000 feet across the west side of the state, down across the eastern Bering Sea into the eastern Aleutians. And jet stream level winds at 30,000 feet. We have a jet core to 120 knots off of Haida Gwaii from the southwest. Otherwise, we're just seeing a broad trough extend from the eastern Bering into the southwestern Gulf. And at 9,000 feet, 700 millibars, stronger winds to 70 knots from the southwest coming in there through British Columbia, just east of the Panhandle, and then a broad area of winds of 40 to 50 knots out of the north there in through the western half of the Bering. And bringing it down to 3,000 feet, we see some winds in through British Columbia upwards to 60 knots from the southwest, but a broad area of winds anywhere from 40 to as high as 60 knots, strongest there through the Bering Strait and extending down through the central and pushing into the eastern Aleutians. This will translate to some considerable moderate turbulence, even some isolated severe turbulence in a broad area from the lower Chukchi Sea through the Bering Strait across St. Lawrence, down across St. Matthew, St. Paul, and much of the Aleutians. So that area is where the greatest turbulence will be, and also some turbulence possible there along the frontal band in through the Panhandle in the area of surface to 5,000 feet. So if you are able to get out, have a safe flight.
Hello again, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with the National Weather Service with another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. And joining me today are not just one, but two people, both with the last name Stevens, which is even more fun, but no relation. We have Eric Stevens from GINA and George Stevens, who is a mechanical engineering student from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Did I get that right?
Yep.
Awesome. And today you guys brought a really cool toy, or I should say tool, with you. It's a sandbox, but why are you guys working on a sandbox?
Well, it's part of our senior design project, and we were approached by AKwx to build this for them. They had a proof of concept that they developed about a year ago, I think, and they wanted a more robust version that they could pack onto a plane and take places, and it's a handy learning tool for kids and adults.
So you're a mechanical engineering student. You've built a traveling sandbox for the experimental program to stimulate competitive research, EPSCoR, and GINA's facilitated this. But why do we need a traveling sandbox?
Well, the prototype was such a big hit that they decided they wanted another one, actually two, that that would be easier to travel with, possibly marketable even.
Okay, so this is a traveling sandbox that's got a lot of bits and pieces and a computer hooked up to it. What is the computer doing with the sand?
The computer actually uses a Kinect sensor to read the topography of the sand or the shape of the sand, and then the computer translates that into information which it projects using a projector onto the sand, showing topographical lines and which is representative of the shape of the sand.
Okay, so this is a live mapping tool?
Yeah. It's interactive. As you're moving your hands through it, it is actively following and changing the lines to fit what you're doing.
That sounds like something I could have in my backyard.
Yep.
It'd be a lot of fun. So you guys had to change the design a little bit to make this more Alaska-fied, right?
Yeah.
Okay, how'd you do that?
Well, the original was made out of basically lumber and Simpson strong tie type stuff, and we rebuilt it to make it lighter and basically more transportable. We can pack it down to a fairly small size, and it can be loaded onto a plane and flown anywhere in the state.
Which you guys did today. And you have plans to take this in other places of Alaska, right?
Yep, we're actually going to be headed down to Homer with it later today.
Okay, very good. Eric, how does this fit into science learning around Alaska?
Well, you know what? I think it is a tool and it is a toy. And it brings out a smile from an 8-year-old and the smile from a 48-year-old with that inner 8-year-old wanting to get out. The sandbox, it's an interactive learning tool that teaches us how topography in the 3 dimensions is related to, say, a 2-dimensional map. More about that later. Just like George was saying, it's got a Kinect sensor, not just for video games anymore. It can sense out the lay of the land there, feeds that information in the computer identifies that, sends a signal to a projector to send topographic lines to map over that lumpy ground. So you get a 3-dimensional topo map out of it. And my favorite thing about it, this is the thing that stops people at the trade show. They stop at your booth and don't leave, is that you run your hand through that sandbox and it responds in real time. It remaps the topography as you get to be Mr. Tectonic Plate Drifter there. You can make things how you want. Well, what if we made a really high mountain here and a low valley there, and the lines adjust to what you did? It's a learning tool because it shows you that connection between these two-dimensional topo lines and what's really out in Alaska. And Alaska's a place with all kinds of topography. You know, we're from the Great Plains, where topo maps tend to be just like blank pieces of paper, but Alaska is particularly gifted in this regard, and this tool helps us, I think, learn more about our state, really.
Absolutely. And so this is going to enhance STEM learning, the science, technology, engineering, and math, in many different locations around Alaska. Then this would be something that kids and teachers can get their hands on.
It sure is. And I mentioned the it's like fly paper at a booth that, or at the Science Potpourri when we had Greg's original version of this sandbox, and that one was made out of scraps of wood, and it was a prototype. But even that one, before it had some of the refinements that George and crew have made for this newer, upscaled, maybe a 2.0 version of the sandbox, even that one was so attractive to people. It just demonstrated that this has potential to be a learning tool, an outreach tool, an education tool that now is portable and can go places in Alaska. Of course, there's only one sandbox, can't be everywhere at once, but hopefully it gets out there, gets the word out about EPSCoR and what science is being done here for Alaskans.
All right, that sounds really interesting, and I can't wait to get my hands in the sand and try this out for myself. We're going to demonstrate this here in our next segment of Alaska Weather Facts, but before we go, we want to remind you that EPSCoR, which is a new acronym for me now, but I'm going to remember this because you can follow them on Facebook and Twitter, and I invite you to do that. Alaska EPSCoR is also something that facilitates science learning at the University of Alaska around the state, and that stands for Experimental Program to Stimulate Competitive Research. So check that out, and make sure you tune in tomorrow because we're going to have the next version where we actually get our hands in the sand and check out how this works and demonstrates that topography. So for now, I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder with this edition of Alaska Weather Facts, and we'll see you again next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back, and looking at the sea ice edge, the main consideration, we have strong area of Arctic high pressure over eastern Russia, and then we have low pressure, a couple areas of low pressure in the Gulf. And on the North Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula, it's the pressure gradient between these two systems that are setting up some stronger northeast to north winds along the Chukchi Sea coast, especially from Utqiagvik down through Point Hope, and then especially through the Bering Strait and the north side of St. Lawrence. We expect some gale force winds. And as a result, even though the ice is redeveloping with the colder temperatures, there could be some shifting around with those stronger winds and the resulting currents. Also along areas of Norton Sound in through the lower Yukon and Kuskokwim deltas, the ice should begin to redevelop there with the colder air that'll be funneling in, not just from the north, but pushing eastward. There's a fair amount of cold air over the central Bering that'll push eastward as well. Looking at Monday across the Panhandle, some strong winds with the frontal system. We could see gales on the order of 40-45 knots, inner channels, southeast winds 35 to 45 knots, gust up to 50 knots possible. Southern areas of the Panhandle as well as around Petersburg. Further north, we expect south winds 25 knots, Lynn Canal with waves of 5 feet. The outer coast waves could run as high as near 20 feet south of Sitka and off of Craig. For Tuesday, winds will be southeast inner channels, 15 to 20 knots. Could still have some gusts down there toward Dixon entrance to 40 knots. Waves generally running 3 feet, but upwards of 5 feet there, Dixon entrance, and 10 feet or so off the coast west of Craig, Sitka, Gustavus. And on Monday for the northwestern Gulf, little weak area of low pressure, very weak center there off the Kenai Peninsula, variable winds 10 knots. In Prince William Sound, east winds 15 knots, waves 3 feet. And look for winds out of the northeast, 15 to as high as 25 knots through the lower half of Cook Inlet with waves of 4 to 5 feet. On Tuesday, winds will be out of the north in Prince William Sound at 15 knots, waves 3 feet. Look for northwest winds off the Kenai to 20 knots, and then through a lower portion of Cook Inlet into northeast of Kodiak, winds will be as high as 30 to 35 knots from the northwest, with waves running around 9-10 feet. Across Kodiak Island on Monday, variable winds 10 knots, Shelikof Strait, but winds will turn more westerly south of Sandpoint to 30 knots with waves of 10 feet. And there are going to be stronger winds coming in from the northwest, especially as you get from Cold Bay westward as a frontal system pushes its way eastward. Quite strong winds could build waves 18 feet and certainly higher than that west of Cold Bay out there through the northern Bering and the eastern Aleutians. And then on Tuesday, look for winds to generally be out of the northwest across much of the area, 35 to 40 knot gales, either Bering or North Pacific side, with waves running generally 12 to 14 feet, but as high as 18 feet north of Cold Bay. Here comes those strong winds out of the central Bering. Northwest winds pushing across the eastern Aleutians, eastern half of the Aleutians, to 40 knots. Waves running right around or just over 20 feet on the Bering side and 14 to 18 feet on the North Pacific side. And then for Tuesday, winds will turn more toward the west, 30 to 35 knots. Waves running 10 to 12 feet on the North Pacific side. Still 13 to as high as 18 feet lingering there north of Dutch Harbor. And along the southwest coast, we are looking at 40 knot north to northwest winds south of St. Lawrence, west of Nunavik Island from St. Matthew down to St. Paul, St. George. Waves 14 to as high as 18 feet. North winds, though, within Norton Sound only 10 knots and waves 2 feet there. But on Tuesday, those winds will make some inroads toward the coast. We're looking at northwest winds 20 knots and Norton Sound waves 5 feet, but look for 30 to 35 knot winds south of St. Lawrence down through and around Nunavik Island, including the Atoll and Strait, and areas east of St. Paul and St. George, with waves running anywhere from around 12 to say maybe as high as 15 feet. And then along the Arctic coast, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots, increasing upwards of 40 knot gales out of the north through the lower Chukchi Sea, Bering Strait, north side of St. Lawrence, with waves 10 to 14 feet. And on Tuesday, northeast winds continue along the Arctic coast with plenty of ice in place, 20 knots, but they accelerate to north-northwest, passing through the Bering Strait to 35 knot gales, with waves running as high as 12 feet through the lower Chukchi Sea and on the north side of St. Lawrence Island. So that wraps up the show for this Sunday evening. Thank you for joining me the past few nights, and have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.